Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said he had intensified talks with Russia on deploying tactical nuclear weapons in his country. He alleged there was a planned invasion of Belarus from neighboring Poland. Moscow's plan to place nuclear weapons in Belarus will help protect this country, which is under threat from the West, he said in an annual address to lawmakers and government officials Friday. "Trust me, I never deceived you. They are preparing to invade Belarus, to destroy our country," he continued, quoted by ABC Net. President Lukashenko said he and Russian President Vladimir Putin could deploy strategic weapons of nuclear weapons in Belarus if needed. It was a more powerful system and could destroy entire cities thousands of miles away. "I am not trying to intimidate or blackmail anyone. I want to protect the Belarusian nation and ensure peace for our people," said President Lukashenko. Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Previously, President Vladimir Putin was to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. This decision is a strategy in response to pressure from the United States, US, and allies. In his speech on Saturday, President Vladimir Putin said the immediate trigger for this decision was the British government providing Ukraine with depleted uranium. "The components can penetrate armored vehicles," Al Jazeera quoted. President Vladimir Putin also said that the plan does not violate any rules, because the US has also placed nuclear weapons in NATO member countries. The tactical nuclear weapons to be deployed in Belarus are weapons that can destroy troops and weapons in war. This weapon has a short range with a lower yield than the nuclear warheads on strategic missiles, which can wipe out entire cities. Belarus suggests unconditional armistice. The president of Belarus also suggested an unconditional ceasefire to Ukraine. He warned that Russia would be forced to use its most terrible weapons if it felt threatened. "It is impossible to defeat nuclear power. If the Russian leadership understands that the situation threatens to lead to the disintegration of Russia, it will use the most terrible weapons. This cannot be allowed," he said, quoted from Al Arabiya. The Russian side supports Lukashenko's ceasefire proposal. The Russian government says President Vladimir Putin and President Lukashenko will discuss it next week, but the situation in Ukraine has not changed. Ukraine had previously rejected Belarus' offer to broker peace. The Ukrainian government says Russia continues to use Belarusian airspace for drone and missile attacks against Ukraine, including during the launch of the invasion. Belarus says it will not enter the war, but is allied closely with Russia, including holding joint military exercises. France believes that only China is capable of granting a peace deal to Ukraine. China's strength and close ties to Russia suggest it may be the only country on Earth capable of brokering a deal in Ukraine. This statement was made by an internal source of the French presidency last Friday. This response comes ahead of French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to China next week. It is clear that China is one of the few countries on Earth and perhaps the only country in the world to have a game-changer effect on the conflict for these two sides, the source said. China has positioned itself as a potential arbiter for peace in Ukraine, with the ruling Communist Party releasing its 12-point position for solving the political crisis of Ukraine last February. Although described in Western media as a peace plan, the document does not offer step-by-step guidance for ending the conflict. Instead, it lists the principles that China recommends any future deal adhere to. The 12 points include concessions for both parties. For example, China emphasizes that the sovereignty of all nations must be respected, referring to Ukraine's insistence on returning its pre-conflict borders. Not only that, the country led by President Xi Jinping also emphasized that the legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously. This refers to Russia's refusal to accept further NATO expansion along its borders. China's position was welcomed by Russia, but was rejected by the United States, US State Department as a tactical move to stop the conflict in Russia's favor. In Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky said he only agreed with a few points in the document. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron will travel to China on Wednesday to meet with President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang. According to CNN, he will try to find a way to identify solutions to end this war in the medium term. But Reuters reported that Macron would issue a stern warning to Xi not to provide weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. Our message will be clear. There may be a temptation to get closer to Russia, but don't cross that line, said a French diplomat who declined to be named. Whether China will heed the warning is another story. But as the US ramped up its military presence around Chinese-claimed territory and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hinted at the diplomatic consequences for China of its relationship with Russia, Xi signed a dozen agreements with Putin last month. Meanwhile, China's defense ministry said that China is ready to strengthen military cooperation with Russia. The European Union is still doing business with Russia despite sanctions. The European Union, EU, has imposed 10 rounds of sanctions against Russia since Moscow invaded Ukraine in February last year. The EU says its sanctions are meant to cut into Russia's revenue and cut off access to technology used in war. But the impact will not be severe enough to limit Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine in 2023, according to a European Parliament research note. Much trade is still flowing between the European Union and Russia, indicating the EU is reluctant to take a harder economic hit and concerns about ripple effects on global supply chains. Instead of seeking new sanctions, the EU is now looking to crack down on violations that are already in place, and officials identify the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan as potential sanctions evasion routes. Russia is the EU's fifth largest trading partner, with exchanges of goods reaching €258 billion, $280 billion, by 2021, according to the European Commission executive. The EU's main imports are fuel, timber, iron and steel, and fertilizers. Since the Moscow invasion began last year, the value of EU imports from Russia halved to around €10 billion, $10.85 billion, last December. In total, the EU imported 171 billion euros or $186 billion worth of goods from Russia from March 2022 to the end of January 2023, according to the latest data available from Eurostat, the EU Statistical Office. LNG trading. The European Union approved a ban on imports of Russian coal and oil last year. Gas is not subject to EU sanctions, but Moscow has slashed its pipeline gas shipments to Europe since the invasion began. The EU received about 40% less Russian gas in the past year compared to recent years. However, liquefied natural gas, LNG, seems to be another story. Shipments of Russian LNG to Europe have increased since the war, to 22 billion cubic meters last year, up from around 16 billion cubic meters in 2021, according to an EU analysis. LNG volumes are less than Russia's pipelined gas shipments, which were around 165 billion cubic meters a year before the war broke out. But the increases have led several countries to invoke legal options under EU law to block LNG imports. Nuclear industry products similar to LNG, no sanctions have been imposed on Russia's nuclear industry. Had this ban been carried out, Hungary and Bulgaria would have been the countries against the witness. Russian nuclear energy company Rosatom is known to be expanding the Pax power plant, which is located 5 kilometers from the city of Pax, central Hungary. EU imports of products from Russia's nuclear industry will reach nearly €750 million by 2022, according to Eurostat. The EU's nuclear agency, Euratom, says Russia is providing 1/5 of the uranium used by EU utilities in 2021, as well as 1/4 of conversion and 1/3 of enrichment services. France's energy ministry disputed the Greenpeace report, which said France had increased its uranium imports from Russia since the invasion. However, France said its contract with Russia would cost more to terminate than to continue. Delivery of diamond products. The EU bought €1.4 billion, $1.52 billion, worth of Russian diamonds last year, according to Eurostat, as it did not ban imports of the gems or Russian-controlled miner Alrosa. Belgium, home to the world's largest diamond trading center Antwerp, has disappointed the bloc's top brass by defying the European Union acting alone to ban Russian diamonds. Chemicals and raw materials. Imports of Russian fertilizer by the EU were valued at €2.6 billion, $2.82 billion, last year, up more than 40% from 2021 as rising prices outweighed falling volumes, according to Eurostat. Potash from Russia and its ally Belarus is strictly restricted or banned in the EU. But other fertilizers including urea flow freely, says Fertilizers Europe Director, Sean Mackel. Meanwhile, disagreement among the EU's 27 nations over a proposed exemption to keep fertilizer going to Africa has blocked more sanctions against Belarus, which has aided Russia's war. Among the raw materials not subject to sanctions is nickel, which is mostly used for the production of stainless steel. The European Union imported €2.1 billion worth of nickel in 2021, up to €3.2 billion last year, according to Eurostat data. Missing big names on the EU blacklist. Alrosa and Rosatom are missing from the EU blacklist, which currently includes nearly 1,700 individuals and entities banned from the bloc. Gazprombank's financial business unit of Russian energy giant Gazprombank and Russia's second-largest oil producer Lukoil were also missing from the list.